Hi, welcome back. There's a lot going on in the world right now. So much so that I find it hard to function sometimes. So, what better time to come back to the Messy Desk with your host, me, a human man. Today, we are going to focus on one part of the Octatrack, and it's a biggin. Well, it's a small one, but it's a biggin. Right here. This is the only part that exists today. A, B, and a little squeaky in between. I talked about in my last video about how the crossfader of the Octatrack is the best thing since sliced bread. And if we're being honest, it's probably better than sliced bread. I've had PB&Js my whole life, but it's never made me feel anything like this boy right here has made me feel. So, sorry, Grandma. But, all that aside, I want to talk about the various different ways I use this. It is certainly not comprehensive of all the ways that you can use it. Just like my last video, I want to keep this, all about me. It's about my process and the way that I do things because I'm important. And everything else outside of that, outside of me, who cares, right? Big who cares. But really, I want to focus on the things that I do moment to moment, day to day, when I use the Octatrack to try to make music. And actually, funnily enough, have a project here that I did some weeks ago. Sorry, my stuff's mad dusty. It has been some weeks since I've made any music. Anyway, I have a project here that I did some weeks ago that sort of uses most of these techniques and makes use of most of these little tricks or I don't know, fun things that I've come to use the Crossfader for. So the track sounds like this. So let's just plug me for a second here. Ooh, who is he? Wait for it. A little horn action. Oh, the kids love the horn action. Okay, so now that we're nice and horny, let's talk about how the scene fader is used in general, and then how it directly applies to this project. So I have some notes here, and the most common thing that the scene fader is used for me is what I call, I don't know what the actual, if there's an actual name for this, but I call it a turnaround, which is basically in the last couple beats of a pattern, how can you make the pattern coming back around feel most effective? Because if you just let something loop, it's well and fine, but it's going to get boring really quickly. And a way to keep interest, at least for me while I'm just jamming, is to add these little turnarounds. So like an example that's really, really simple and really easy that I've shown in my last video, and it shows up in all my videos, meaning my videos on Instagram, is a high pass or a low pass filter right before the pattern comes back around. So if we play it again, sure I'm on the right one here. Yeah. So now we're in the last couple of beats. And it makes the pattern restarting feel a little more, it gives a little more oomph because that high pass taking out some elements adds some anticipation and you bring it back. Another example would be a low pass, super simple, super baseline stuff. Another thing that actually is used in that same pattern that I use crossfades for a lot, and again, this is pretty base level stuff, is mute states. So in classic Octatrack fashion, there are numerous ways that you can do a singular thing. So to mute tracks, you can hold function here and press these little keys, which is not great, kind of clunky. You can also hold function and press down. You'll start here. You can hold function and press down to go to your quick mute trig mode. And this is the mode that I stay in a lot if I'm just jamming around. But an easy, less intensive way to do mutes, because if you're trying to mute some stuff here, unmute some stuff here all at the same time, get kind of hectic. An easier way is to just on scenes mute things. And the way to do that is super simple. You just hold the scene button, and whatever track you don't want to be on, you flick the level down, and it's off. Something to note here as I click this back on. In scenes using this big level here, it only goes between maximum level and minimum level. So the loudest it could be or the quietest it could be. In some instances, you might want to just lower the volume of something, and you might think, oh, well, I can't do that now because I only have minimum and maximum classic Electron bullshit. But, au contraire, you can. There's a lot of different levels of gain staging on the Octatrack. So if we go to the amp menu here, we see volume there, and that is something that can be adjusted on a scene change basis. So if you wanted to slowly fade something out, the level not would work anyway, but if you wanted to slam the crossfader over to here and have this just be more quiet for whatever reason, you can do that. The scene slider being used to mute stuff is super useful, especially in concert with effects. So I talked about in my last video, a big kick isn't going to sound great in a giant reverb, which you might want to have on a scene. So if you want to take that kick out, it's super simple. So like, for instance, in this scene, there's no kick. And it's really as simple as flicking it back on if you want it on. But that sound, something nasty just happened to that horn. I hope I didn't fuck something up. Anyway, so it's as simple as that. And you can take it a little bit further if you wanted to. I don't think I have in this project. While it's easy to just have all your scene changes be on B and have A constantly be a home base, if you will. Think of this as a dry wet knob. B is always fully wet. A is always fully dry, right? So, high pass, and we're back to normal. Low pass, and we're back to normal. You can go further than that. You can do what I like to call layering scenes. I say I like to call it that, but I think in Merlin's Guide to the Octatrack, which you absolutely need to read, required reading, if you want to get better at using the Octatrack and gain a better understanding of how the Octatrack works, it's sort of moving back and forth between changes and stacking them on top of each other. That's one way to do it. A thing that I like to do that's sort of an iteration on that is go back and forth making gradual changes, but rather than slide to B where there's a change, slide back to A where there's not a change, make the scene change over here on B, slide back to B, make the change, slide back to A, all that going back and forth between your quote-unquote dry sound and your quote-unquote wet sound is going to be a little jarring. So what you can do is something like this, where let's say I'm in a little bit of a breakdown, right? I mean, we're all in a little bit of a breakdown right now. But let's say the song, much like its creator, is in the midst of a breakdown, and we want to come back to something new that is not necessarily a new pattern, but just something new sonically with content we already have. We can switch the scene on A as well. And you can see here I have another scene prepared. So this, all I've done here is put a filter on one of the samples to give it kind of a, you can see the attack's kind of high, a sort of a swelling up. So if I wanted to come out of my breakdown and go into that, I can do that. So let's say we're here. And we want to do something different, but we don't want to change patterns yet. Whoops. Turn scene A here. And now you can hear that filter. And we can take this further over here. See, we're building on the change we just made by sliding over to A. And again, we'll take that further. And now we're back to what is our new normal, basically. And we can hang out here for a little bit if we want, or we could use a turnaround. Back to 1. And we're back to our home base. And it's given a lot of movement to just one pattern. And you can definitely see how if you extrapolate that and do that across multiple patterns and layer it further, you can really get some dense, complex changes out of ultimately very little creative material. And to go over what the changes were there, we start with just a high pass on the master. Here. The kick is muted. I don't know if anything else is muted. The bass is muted, obviously. And then over here, we make the change to scene 2, where again, the only difference is that there is a filter and an envelope on that filter, obviously, with a slow attack on the main melodic sample. So if I solo that. Right? So we come out of the high pass. And then we come over here, scene 13. You can see that there are some changes. We still have that filter going on with slightly different settings for some reason. But you can also see there is a fair amount of sample reduction and bit reduction on the snare. There is some filtering of one of the samples, the melodic samples, I mean. Filtering of the bass so it's not too boomy. Anyone ever watch Avatar? Not too boomy, you know what I'm saying? And just every parameter on the lo-fi effect of the melodic sample is going on here. So to go over what each of these are, some of them are pretty apparent. Distortion, sample reduction, bit reduction. And I talked about this in my last video. I could crack open the manual, but that's for chumps. I like to just feel my way through it blindly. I think this is some sort of amplitude modulation. It's probably amplitude modulation frequency and amplitude modulation depth. That's my guess. That would make the most sense. But then again, this is an Electron device. I wouldn't be surprised if it's something entirely different. So we got a fair amount of that going on. Again, I'm going to solo that so you can hear. So it has this really crispy, kind of chunky cracklies that I just love so much. So let's unsolo that. So again, that kind of carries over from this. Other things I have going on in this scene. The reverb is fully wet on one of the main melodic samples. Very big reverb. This, I don't think, is anything. Sometimes that happens. You'll accidentally bump a knob and it looks like you've made a change in the scene, but really it's nothing. There's a little bit of low pass on the reverb because I don't know. I have misophonia and I don't like really high frequencies bouncing off reverbs most of the time. Again, pretty high, pretty big reverb on the snare here. A little bit more rolled off, but barely any. Some distortion on the bass. Basically, this is something new that I've gotten into doing, which is just the fuck it up section. Just take what you have and throw it in a blender, and it disorients and it's weird, and sometimes it's off-putting, but hey, so am I. And then when you bring it back, it's quite pleasant. You know, I follow that philosophy in my own life. I take my life, it's going okay, sounds great, looks great. I chuck it in a blender. My family's worried about me. My friends are worried about me. It's disorienting. It's gross. It sounds bad and is unappealing. But then, whoop, you bounce it back, and all of a sudden, they're not so worried about you. And it's great. So we're here. Now, if we wanted to, we could go back to home base, right? But why stop there, right? We're already in the blender section. Let's take the blender section a little further and have a little breakdown within a breakdown. And this is a technique that I've been wanting to show off for a little while. It's by no means unique to me. I mean, what is musically? I picked this up from a combination of things from Mr. Bill, the God, John Hopkins, and Against All Logic. And it's so appealing to me, which is running percussion through a comb filter and using the pitch of that to make a melody. So here I have my kick. It has a lo-fi effect and a comb filter effect on it. And I have the feedback up and the mix up so we can hear it, obviously. Let's solo it so we can hear what's happening. And it makes this little kind of mini tight bass line, and it's very snappy. I love the tone. Usually I don't praise Electron too much on the tone of their effects. They're pretty bad for the most part. You can make the most out of them. You kind of make do. But their lo-fi and their comb filter are two of the effects that I would suggest most you use if you really want a specific kind of texture that is actually pretty good. Most of the time we're just working around the effects in the Octatrack, but I genuinely enjoy using the comb filter and the lo-fi, which is, they appear everywhere in my music. So what I'm doing here to do this is the bass pitch is D, and if we go into the step sequencer here, you can see, if we click here, maybe baby, yeah, here we are. If we click here, you can see I've step locking, so I'm locking a set of parameter changes to one step. I'm step locking the feedback, and I believe, I don't have this committed to memory. I am an expert, of course, but I don't know. I think the feedback the higher it is, the more the comb filter rings out. So it's almost like, if you think of it in terms of an amplitude envelope, the decay is longer. So I'm locking that, so it's a little bit longer here, and then I'm changing the pitch again here. So it's fairly obvious. You can see I'm just changing the pitches where necessary to follow the sample melodically. And so the result is this kind of cool little breakdown. Something that I've had trouble with, I don't really know why this is, because the Octatrack is the Octatrack. But on one of my samples here, I think it's either an LFO, so it must not be. It must be the amplitude modulation. Yeah, so I have the amplitude modulation and the amplitude depth at a very certain thing. And sometimes it is in time with this little breakdown, and sometimes it's not. And I cannot for the life of me figure out why. It just sort of phases in and out. It's imperfect. So for what it's worth, take that into consideration when you want to use something like this in your track, because sometimes you fade over to it and it's a little bit out of time. So let's see if it's in time. Yeah, that's a little loose. And then, so in using a bunch of these techniques all together, using mute states, using turnarounds, using transitions like that, using breakdowns, you can perform around with one pattern for much longer than you probably have any right to. So let's just jam for a second with this, and I'll kind of show you what I mean. So let's start with A at our home bass, B, let's keep that at 14, which is our high pass. And we'll do some turnarounds. These are going to be some mute state changes, because those are just locked to my high and low pass and some of these here. And we're just going to jam with the pattern for a bit, and you'll kind of see what I mean. This is what I mean about it not being in sync sometimes. Yeah, sometimes if you slam it back, it'll come back around, but you get it, right? You can use these relatively small changes, relatively low effort changes, I would say, and sort of use sound design as an avenue to structural progression in a track. And that's kind of the way that I love to make music on the Octatrack, is using effects changes, parameter changes, these sort of turnarounds and transitions and breakdowns as a way to put it bluntly, not have to do more work. Because, you know, making music is work, and work sucks. It's a really fun way to just jam around with one pattern. And it's amazing in a live setting. If you have multiple patterns, if you're not lazy like me, then just think about how exponentially those things stack onto each other. And it's not as though what applies to one pattern can't apply to the next pattern. So like if I had a B section outside of this pattern with different melodic content, I still have all of these scenes here. And those changes are still applied to these machines because it's not per pattern. It's a global thing, as long as you're in the same part. And we'll do a video on parts later. So it's not as though you have to do that work again. You might need to create some duplicates of the scenes and tamper to get specific results tailored to that pattern or whatever. But the baseline structure, the foundation of what kind of changes you want to make are already there. And in the realm of something like, you know, the amplitude modulation, bit crushing, that might not apply all the time. But a low pass and a high pass filter, it's hard to fuck that up. You know what I mean? It's hard to go wrong with slamming into a high pass before you bring your track back around, especially if you're working with something a little more high energy than this. This is pretty laid back. But that's it, basically. It is by no means, as I said, comprehensive. It is not every single way that you could use the scene slider, because, I'm finding out new things every day. But it's how I use it most of the time. It's the things that I use it for. And I think that that's the most useful thing that I can offer to you, is how I use this. Because you can find infinite tutorials about how someone else uses it, or just bare bones, here's what the manual says, and now I'm going to read it to you, how this thing works. But in my opinion, the most valuable thing for someone who has seen those tutorials already, knows how this thing works on a baseline mechanical level, the most useful thing is, okay, how do I actually apply that? How is someone actually making music with this? Because I can't tell you the number of times that I've watched a tutorial like, here's how you use this thing. Here's how, you program steps on the sequencer and hit play. It's like, that's great. And you can make patterns out of that. But how does that translate into performance? How does that translate into full tracks? How does that translate into growing with an instrument? And I think that's what the purpose of this video is for me, is to show you guys the way I use it and how it pertains to my specific creative process, so that you can take some of these tips. I'm gesturing with my right hand, which you can't see, so that you can take it to your creative process. And what works for me might not work for you, but the hope is some of this stuff is useful to you and can be integrated into your creative process, so that when someone asks you, how do you use the Octatrack, you can show them, well, here are the things that I use in my process. And it just sort of carries on in a distributive way like that. So feel free to comment anything that I missed, or I'm sure anything I said that was wrong about the way the Octatrack works, because I recorded this whole bit about how the quick mute trig mode wasn't global, but then I clicked over to a track and dog, it fucking is global. It's Mr. Worldwide. So I don't know everything. I really don't. And the fact that I've been using this for a year, I sort of muscle memory my way around and brute force my way through some things when I don't understand. Like the amplitude modulation, amplitude frequency is a great example of that. I don't actually know if that's what that is. It just sounds like it, so I assume that's what it is. Listen, I don't have book smarts, okay? I have street smarts, all right? Anyway, hopefully this video is shorter than my last one, a little more to the point, a little less digressions, although those are fun. But I really hope that it helps you, and that it gives you some useful tips. And again, if you use the Crossfader in different or interesting ways, please let me know in the comments, or just send me a message, because I'm always looking for new ways to use this thing. I'm always looking for new things to try. And at this point in time, I feel like I sort of hit a wall in my own creative process, so it might be useful to get something from someone else. So that's the end of the video. I have to do this. If I don't, the CEO of YouTube will break down my door and break my knees and kill me. So just bear with me. Please like the video. If you enjoyed what you see and you'd like to see more, subscribe and ding the bell for notifications. And if you want to see other video topics, comment down below what you want to see, and I'll read them and do it. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.